Welcome to OCCULTISM, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, history, philosophy, and fiction. In this episode, I'll go through a biography that I really enjoyed of George Washington by Willard Stern Randall. But before I begin, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. It does help the channel to grow. Now, this edition is by Henry Colt and Company, and it's from 1998, George Washington, A Life by Willard Stern Randall. Now, the biography in general is good. A lot of modern biographies tend to have an almost fiction-based narrative structure. A lot of modern biographers feel the need to create a book that is closer to a novel than to a data or information thick work in which it's primarily an accumulation of historical facts that in an organized fashion leads you to understand the person that we are studying. In fact, a lot of modern biographies are almost impossible to distinguish from fiction. The structure is very similar, and there is almost a bombastic, exaggerated tone to the work to make it exciting for the reader. This work is not like that, and I think that's a positive because it allows you to focus on the important details of the historical context from which a person like George Washington stemmed from. Now, as a person, George Washington is very interesting because he's not only considered the father of the United States, so as a historical personage, he is already famous worldwide, but also because there is a lot of mythology surrounding George Washington. Most people that speak of George Washington don't know much about him. They have a basic conception, and either you see him as a saint of some sort, or you see him as some kind of villain if you are particularly inclined towards a political perspective that views any person of the past to be evil and abusive or a colonialist of some kind because of his views on slavery or women or even wealth. So obviously that's going to taint and in some way distort your view of George Washington. I would say it's quite a modern phenomenon to have Americans view George Washington in any negative way. I would say even to see him in any critical way. So I do find it positive to have books that are critical, and I actually don't think this book is particularly critical, but it is quite straightforward when it comes to the nice and the ugly. It doesn't hide certain things that would be uncomfortable for some people. But like I said, in modern times, people have taken the opposite position, and some young people that I've heard online consider George Washington to be the biggest villain ever. So it is an extreme overcompensation of seeing George Washington as a perfect human being, and you have a lot of modern people that go the opposite direction and consider him the worst human being. And I think they're both ridiculously simplistic and unrealistic. I'm just going to go through a few of the points that I think merit some discussion, and hopefully that will encourage you to read the book. So one thing that I found very curious is that George Washington modeled his life on a book. And of course, because of the focus of this channel, then obviously that would be something that will stand out to me. It was a book printed in 1730 on civilities for gentlemen, and it became basically George Washington's civil religion. He actually wrote down the rules that he derived from this book. He called it the Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. And he used this book as a guide, almost like a Bible of sorts. And what's interesting is this book, if you do research on it, is derived from a Jesuit handbook written in the 16th century that gave some of the basic rules of behavior for social interaction. And this is very common to find during that time As a matter of fact, in Spain, you have a lot of works that stem from the Catholic Church that are specifically aimed at developing young men's mentality when it comes to their interaction with others, their peers, women, superiors, etc. So there is a cultural influence in these sorts of books, and I found it fascinating that George Washington was influenced by this, and he even took it to heart to such a level that he kind of molded his entire personality around it. Another aspect of Washington that is good to know is that he was a land surveyor, and to me that's one of the most dynamic aspects of his personality, because he started doing land surveying when he was very, very young. So that means he would go out for days, weeks, into the wilderness to survey land for real estate purposes. But we're talking about very expansive land filled with Native Americans and the French, and also wild animals and a lot of the other dangers that are involved in this. So just imagining, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old going into these environments to do land surveying is quite an impressive thing. And obviously it indicates how maturity developed a lot faster at the time. Another aspect that I think is great to talk about is Masonry, because a lot of people know, I think, in popular culture already that George Washington was a Mason and that he participated in Masonry. But a lot of people usually just see it either as a conspiracy of some kind. Anything that has to do with Masonry is, by the modern mind, the modern thinking, is seen as an accusation of evil behavior of some sort. But Masonry was pretty common at the time. In Europe, it was developing in Europe around that time. It'd been around for almost 100 years already. So no surprise that George Washington saw himself as a perfect candidate for a Masonic lodge. And actually, he is one of the first 5 members of the Fredericksburg, Virginia Lodge. And he saw it as an opportunity to advance his military career. And he actually eventually became the highest ranking Mason in the United States. And it could be argued all of America. The Americas, North America, South America. But an important aspect of his Masonic membership is how it impacted his religious viewpoint. Because he used to attend a lot of Anglican services. That was really the church of the time. And he stopped attending church, and then he stopped using what you would call traditional normative Christian terms for God, and he started using Masonic terminology. Terms like supreme being, providence, etc. So terms that are associated with the Masonic philosophy that generalize God from a very particular personal entity, Trinitarian, biblical, and he starts using generic terms because the term supreme being is a generic term. And the same goes for providence. Actually, the term providence even has a theological implication of his participation in time and space, and in a way distancing God from the operations of the universe, which is a typical Masonic perspective. So to the end of his life, he was basically a convinced Mason and not really a traditional Christian. And this applies also to Jefferson, etc. There's many of the founding fathers that were not. They were in their own category, if you will. So when you read the book, you'll get a lot more details. Another aspect of the life of George Washington that is sometimes overlooked is the Battle of Jumonville Glen. And this was a battle led by George Washington that was the very catalyst for the very bloody global conflict called the 7 Years' War, which is a war between the British and the French that spanned the world in different continents. The author of this book says that George Washington single-handedly started the war. I don't know if I would go that far, because obviously there are other components going on to engage a war. No war starts by just a single event per se, but a single event can trigger or will trigger a war. So that single event would be this battle in which George Washington was primarily responsible for, because I think he made a bad decision, a bad call to start shooting in the direction of the French when it was probably not necessary. But that's a judgment call. Obviously, that is difficult to make for historians because you could argue one way or the other. But the point is that decision-making was considered to be a bad one at the time. And that's what really matters when you're reading a book and you try to stay within the limits and the parameters that the book sets for you. From the perspective of those parameters, this was not a good decision. And the result of that decision was catastrophic worldwide. And that is quite interesting considering that George Washington was quite young. This was before the Revolutionary War. And he's really a small-time officer, and already from the start, he creates a global conflict. Quite interesting, and in a weird way, you could call it destiny. And this goes into the issue of Washington as a military commander, because again, a lot of people see Washington as a great military mind or commander. At least I've heard this for many years. But in this book, it's framed in a way that it seems quite possible that this is an exaggeration, because he seems to stumble through battles and skirmishes. He loses forts. He a lot of times loses many men. He loses the Native American tribes that are actually helping him. They run away or they go away, etc., which created conflict in Washington's mind forever. I mean, his entire life, he had a very negative view of Native Americans, primarily because of these experiences he had in which a lot of his allied tribes would abandon him. And because of that, he became bitter about the topic of Native Americans. But he doesn't seem to really be that great of a commander. And I would argue not even in the Revolutionary War, which I think, again, was primarily won because of the French getting involved in that war, the incompetence of a lot of the leadership that the British brought, etc. So that it's not George Washington being some kind of Napoleon who was a brilliant strategic mind, some brilliant commander of some sort, but more a circumstantial scenario in which he was not a bad leader, but he was not necessarily a genius of the battlefield. Another point in the book that I found curious is the issue of slavery, because obviously this is a hot topic. This is one of the reasons that Washington is categorized as evil. Washington did not want slavery extended in the United States, and him and George Mason actually worked to try to pass laws to stop slaves. Of course, their motivation was primarily to attract more white European settlers so that the land could be worked in a particular way and independence will come quicker because of its economic autonomy. And this was openly spoken about. So the argument is given by George Mason and George Washington that the main reason for their desire to diminish slavery is to engage more European settlement. And as a matter of fact, George Washington had a lot of indentured servants that were white. They were pretty common at the time in the North. So that George Washington had African slaves and he had European indentured servants. So he used them both. And as a matter of fact, on a related tangent, even the concept of freedom of religion was primarily aimed at attracting German settlers, because German settlers refused to move into the colonies because the Church of England was the official religion of the state. And a lot of these Catholics, and not only Catholics, even Protestants from Germany who did not like the Anglicans, were not allowed to really practice their religion. So the whole freedom of religion not only fits the Masonic point of view, which is a perennialist, universalist kind of philosophy, but it also fits an economic and social desire to attract more Germans into the colonies, which is quite interesting. I do find important to mention that at the time, there was a lot of contemporary critiques of Washington. John Adams called them indolent or lazy when it comes to his military prowess, and French commanders called them weak. So that is not to say that they're correct. It just indicates an interesting dynamic in history, which is that people in that moment see historical figures in a different way. Another point in the book that I think might be overlooked in its importance is Benedict Arnold, because as a character is almost an avatar of treason and evil for Americans because of his treachery, because of him switching sides and going over to the British. So I can understand why in the popular culture and in the American mythos, he is a devil. But because the book has to talk about him in the context of his relationship with Washington, it does grant you a perspective on how he saw things. In other words, that he was constantly in conflict with the Continental Congress, that he was not paid, that he was disrespected, that his very valuable military mind was not appreciated, etc. So that it gives you some context for him as a character. And although it doesn't go much into it, it's not a biography of his, it is really cool to see a nuance to his personality. When it comes to Washington as a politician, because a lot of people forget that he, as a military commander, he wins the Revolutionary War, and obviously he's then elected the first president of the United States. He was reticent about this, didn't necessarily want to be president, but he runs, becomes president. He gets 2 terms, but he was a strong advocate of a central government. So he was not really a big advocate of states' rights, for example, like Jefferson was, but more of a centralized, powerful government and a very powerful executive. As a matter of fact, he advocated for a direct vote on the executive, on the president, and not the Electoral College, which is a diffused and state-centered system in which it's really the legislatures who are supposed to vote for president. A lot of people are not aware that when you're voting, you're not voting in the United States directly for the president. You're technically voting for representatives who have the right to vote for the president, which are the elect. Now, historically, these electors were selected by the legislatures. It was democratic because you chose your legislators, and then your legislators chose the electors. The electors that would then go to the Electoral College and vote for the president, for the chief executive on the federal level. Most states, well, I would say today all states, but it was a slow process, have granted the citizens the ability to vote for them, but technically they could actually revoke that as well. There's a lot of legal complications in that, but constitutionally, at least, the right to vote is really given to the legislature. It's not really given to the voters of each state. But Washington wanted it to be direct vote for the chief executive. Complete different system, a more federally focused system. And I would say it's not a very popular idea. Even these days, even people that hate the Electoral College may not really appreciate the consequences of having a very strong central government. So very fascinating that Washington was a centralist. And of course, that's the philosophy of the Federalists. But he also believed in an executive that was very strong, including the promotion of the idea that not even the presidential veto should be overruled. He believed in the power of the executive to veto laws, and those vetoes would be absolute, strong, and almost impossible to revoke. Pretty clearly what you would call an executive elected king, which actually is something that Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and some of these founding fathers kind of were inclined towards. They seem to be more in favor of an elected monarchy in which you would have an executive from maybe a group of, founding families that would be elected. But once they're elected, they would have a lot of executive power and not be in constant conflict with the Supreme Court and with the legislature, etc. Of course, Jefferson was the complete opposite. He believed in state rights, way above a central government. He believed central governments were inclined towards perversion, tyranny, etc. So here you have the basic fight between traditional left and right wing in the United States, in which the traditional right wing was against a centralized government, for states' rights, a diffused executive basically as well, whereas the traditional left was more for a centralized government and an executive that is stronger. And to this day, you could still argue that that's the case, with a lot of nuances that I don't want to get into because this is not really a political channel. I'm just analyzing the situation with Washington and how he influenced the culture of how the United States sees itself. And I would say the two main personalities of the founding United States are Washington and Jefferson. And to this day, you see the effects of that. And finally, in connection to this strong executive, Washington hated the press because he believed the press was corrupt constantly. And when John Adams passed the Alien and Sedition laws, which were aimed at persecuting a lot of the press that was critical of the Federalists, George Washington tacitly approved of them because he hated the press. And he didn't think that political parties were good, and in particular because he didn't want any opposition to the Federalist movement. So it gives you some perspective, because a lot of people see Washington as a highly religious character, as a highly capable military commander, and as a kind of traditional hard constitutionalist of some sort. But he really didn't like most of the Constitution. He didn't really consider the hard separation between centralized federal government and the states to be that great. He was not really that much a fan of free speech as we understand it. So my point is, there's a lot of misconceptions that stem from a lack of understanding of him as a character. Now, this is just one biography, and all biographies are going to have a leaning, a bent, a particular perspective. So obviously I encourage all of you to not only read this one, but find other biographies that may be a little different when it comes to their bent, and that may have a nuanced perspective, or even a better, more accurate perspective. I read multiple biographies, I don't just read one, but I wanted to review this one and stay in that mood, stay in the mood of the book and what it presents, to encourage you to read it and see what you think about it. So if you suggest other books, other biographies that you think I should read that maybe give opposite perspectives on Washington, that may give a more positive or more negative perspective on Washington, I'm very open to read them, and if I like them, review them. Again, the whole point of this is to discuss books and the topics, and not necessarily all the political complications that stem out of that, because again, I'll discuss the politics that are consequential within the two covers of a book. So hopefully you enjoyed this review. Remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, share the video, comment on the video. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.